Thank you. I'm very honored to be invited to be among you and a little bit unnerved as a non-Singaporean asked to speak to well-informed insiders and indeed some very distinguished sociologists and historians among you. So forgive me for lapses, and I look forward to corrections. I want to thank especially Arthur Chia for inviting me, and of course the editors and all the writers of these essays. Congratulations to you all and to the publisher. It's been a real pleasure to read through this volume, to read all the essays, both by those who are new to me and those whose names at least I know from other works, such as the path-breaking book on the Socialist Club, Teo Sun Lung's memoir, some of Gui Lisu's poems, some of Terence Lee's essays, and some of Philip Holden's writings on the literary scene. As a non-Singaporean and only sometime visitor over the past few years, what can I add or provoke? This volume does so many things well that I can't resist trying to pick the collective brains assembled here to ask about a few things that had to be left out that I'm curious about and still have no answers to. These are not just political questions which seem to overdetermine almost all discussions about Singapore. Like, for instance, is there a good account of Jeyaretnam's cases beyond those that are presented by Teo here? I'm sure there are. And why was he just jailed or sent away like David Marshall? Or what would society have looked like if David Marshall, Francis Sell, Harry Elias, and the economist Thomas Silcock, who taught most of the first pioneer generation, recalled in this volume by Philip Holden, could have not only formed an alliance among themselves, but with labor politicians in the UK, social economists in Scandinavia like Gunnar Myrdal, and New Deal economists in the United States who might just have had the influence at the IMF and the UN to help provide loans and support. That is, in larger terms, what is the parallel in Singapore with Indonesia's struggle between economists and engineers, which in Singapore's case, I think, according to this volume at least, would have been a struggle between lawyers and economists. And then how come it was engineers that ended up being in control of Singapore's thought patterns, something that so much of current government policy is cautiously and ambivalently trying to rework with talk of less rigid forms of education? Even, heaven forbid, the humanities and social sciences, of which the current Prime Minister is so wary. But let me move on to a few general comments. One fruitful way to read this collection of essays, I would like to think, is less as essays about legacy constraints, which is what so much of the writing about Singapore is, and rather as a love letter to the next generation, those about to graduate from the new experiments in higher education, both here and abroad, those in their 20s and younger, that is, those who have no experience of most of what the Singapore story was about, who have been through the shifting national education agendas outlined in Chapter 4 by Christine Han and that we've just heard about, and made fun of in a lighthearted manner by Maya Gosling's cartoon, The Merlion and Me, and in the front of the book. The younger generations carry consciousnesses, in the plural, partly deeply inscribed by their parents' and grandparents' stories, while superficially parroting and making fun, as students always do, of what they are taught in class, and what also their parents subtly indicate is to be incorporated into public behavior, but otherwise not taken too seriously. One could, of course, also read the book as a deconstruction of those myths, but we've already had so many of those, including by the authors here. I think, for instance, of the rich book on the Socialist Club, which I mentioned before, reprised briefly here in this volume by Sen Guoguan, which is one of the volume's keystone chapters, along with P.T. Tom, Mark Baldun, and Suhaimi Afandi's chapters, reminding everyone that the colonial policies in Singapore, somewhat carried on by the post-colonial policies, were hardly unique to Singapore, that much of the planning process was being worked out in and for post-war Little Britain, and for Mumbai, for instance, at the same time as for Singapore today. I'd add that the plural society mode of governance continues in Singapore today, despite claims of being multicultural, a legacy of the social theorizing of J.S. Furnival, widely read and debated across the British Empire in the several new social and economic institutes to figure out what to do about such colonial formations in a new post-colonial world. What of this way of thinking about society do we still need in the modern world? Is the forward-looking love letter to the next generation question that these chapters ask of us, perhaps most explicitly by Lavani Kateravalu, who flatly says, thank you, it's like a concert with hard holding a microphone, that the racialism of Singapore is not working and is bad governance and needs to be replaced for the new worlds rapidly emerging. Although I must say I find her puzzlingly Pollyannish and even wrong in her assertions about the voluntarism of racial categories elsewhere in the world. Still, I love her forthrightness about the tasks ahead. By detailing some of the mechanisms of social control in these chapters, we are empowered to ask how they can be designed differently. This has become a new puzzle now that the media environment works quite differently than the histories recounted in the variants of the Singapore story. As some of the later chapters by Jack Chia on the Buddhist Social Welfare Organization, Edgar Liao's on Students One Thinks Today in US of the College of Peter and Mary Tan that's involved in activism, social activism, and especially Lo Ka-Seng's on informal settlement organizations. I'm a little puzzled by his continued use of the term squatter settlements after he denies the legitimacy of the term and suggests it might have been better using the Turkish word gecekondu, or informal settlements. In any case, these suggest that we now need good accounts of the fact that everywhere in the world, another long sentence, apologies, creative social transformation has rarely been, with a few notable exceptions, like 1968, the civil rights and anti-Vietnam and Great Society movements in the United States, and less effectively 1968 in France, the Iranian Revolution of 1979, with its unfortunate outcome, the color revolutions of Armenia and other parts of the former USSR, and the recent Arab Spring in Tunisia, but not elsewhere in the Arab world. With those notable exceptions, creative social transformations have rarely been the outcome of pure resistance to capitalism or authoritarianism or opposition to power, but rather of the remaking of everyday existence below the radar of control in mundane and yet unexpected ways. Singapore is nothing, as Arthur Chia's chapter reprises, if not a master example of continuous rebranding using China-style mass repetition of slogans and poster campaigns to more and more sophisticated packaging and advertising, putting to work the tools of advertising creatives as well as public relations exercises and news and information management. Question, how much of this is old-fashioned political control, and how much is an emergent governance architecture of databases, algorithms, and even artificial intelligence learning of what, thank you, the philosopher Gilles Deleuze once called the control society. That is one that acts infrastructurally. The hacks and redesign modalities must be different in these differently time-stamped periods and infrastructures. Complexity of governance makes it both more information-rich and open and more obscure and hidden. Philip Holden reminds us again, I'm sorry he's not here, that Harry Lee Kuan Yew, LKY, Mr. Lee, as he was variously known over the course of his career, by calling him Harry, you know where Holden stands on this, was originally a Fabian socialist. And Ho Chi Minh and Seng Kuo Kwan tried to identify where the conflict between democratic and authoritarian socialism created breaks and rifts that became set in concrete and stone, and economic logic was allowed to rule the roost and become ingrained. The older alternative visions cannot be simply revived. The world has changed. Powerful international forces are at play today, just as they were then, if along different lines today. Today, neoliberalism of everything, instead of power politics over stopping communism. The love letter to the next generation must be optimistic, not just because of fresh blood, but also because so many of the young are entering a market that does not guarantee them long-term jobs or security. They have to feather their nests differently, and by virtue of their own, a term I learned, cherlore, finding a road, they ipso facto are creating a new kind of world. This applies as well to the new global worlds of mobility and migration. Even the Straits Times is becoming aware of the efforts of social entrepreneurs such as A.K.M. Mohsen and his Deep Ashram and weekly Banglar Kanta to help Bangladeshi workers, or the Migrant Workers Poetry Competition, poetry. The Humanitarian Organization of Migration Economics, or Dr. Gentet's help agency to advise maids, employers, and NGOs on health and legal matters. Interestingly, Dr. Gentet, I don't know if I'm pronouncing her name right, is currently running for Member of Parliament in France, although she lives here, to represent French people living outside France, of whom there is a French community, a vibrant community in Singapore, and among other contributions, a lively contributor to the local art scene. So if there's one disappointment with this volume, it is that there are not enough chapters. So a plea for volume 2. Beyond the companion volume edited by Jason Lim and Terrence Lee, Negotiating State and Society, 1965 to 2015, which has essays by some of the same authors as this volume, about Singapore, that there are not enough chapters about the Singapore that is forming all around, inside, and peeking through the legacy structures. New Singapore stories are being woven that look very different from the past. Literature, storytelling, theater, some of the arts are some of the places this is happening most vigorously, despite all the constraints. There are also possibilities pointed to in women's organizations and perhaps even the design world of small enterprises, to name only two places to look, which Singapore of the old mold would want to, and is trying to, economically weaponize, making Singapore, as Terence Lee describes, a potential global media hub, but to do it, these small enterprises, to do it otherwise, alternatively, in the interstices. Design can easily, or with effort, produce otherwise. The head of the Singapore Design Center, for instance, is a powerful woman infected with the good life vibes of California, and is part of a group of professional women trying to both humanize the workplace and turn design increasingly social rather than only device and object oriented. The popularity of team dynamics and leadership workshops, executive and life coaching, storytelling associations for working with both children and adults to create community, playback theater and similar forms like drama boxes, forum theater, taken into the HDB flats of the heartland, the efforts of 9 Years Theater and the Necessary Stage to create multilingual theater as stimulating alternative visions of community, the SMU SUTD competition to create for good rather than just for the market, the remarkable career of Vincent Chen as a healer after he came out of prison, films like Rajagopal's Yellow Bird, or the film Remittance, made with and by Filipina maids and Kickstarter funding, are all indicators of a desire for making intentional spaces for the social within our technoscientific worlds. So I thank the writers, all of you, for an excellent set of essays and pioneering the beginnings of a critical discourse for Singapore. And maybe the weaponized merlions of the altered straits, thank you to the author of that novel, Kevin Wong, and to Philip Holden's blurb on the back, which made me buy it. I hope that the weaponized merlions keep you energized, speculative adventurers and nudgers towards emergent alternative worlds that are already with us, but yet to be seen or recognized, by which time, of course, when they're seen and recognized, they will be history.